Expectations were very high for Starfield. It was Bethesda's first major game since 2015, we don't need to bring up 76, and it wanted to tackle the great unknown, something they only technically did in DLC before. My expectations were very high. Fallout is one of my favorite series, and although 4 was a step down to me from 3, I still loved it. On the fantasy side, I'm really not that big of a fan, unless it's like Fable or Dark Souls or something, but even Skyrim got me to sink a couple dozen hours in. Starfield was my most anticipated game of the year, and I want to talk about what it did right, what it did wrong, and how all of that was influenced years before the game even came out. Looking at it, Starfield should have been the best parts of Bethesda's RPG lineage up until this point. It's really only natural to expect big things from the company that has gotten people to buy the same game on every platform for more than a decade, but because these expectations came from comparisons, I think that those expectations hindered how the game is received and how much I enjoyed it. But let's take it all the way back to 2022 to that first gameplay reveal. For me, the first gameplay reveal did not instill much confidence. The gameplay was laggy, the guns looked like they didn't have any recoil, and since they usually like to show off the best the game has to offer, they chose a random generic building. Like I haven't seen that in Fallout a million times already. But it's space. So I'm gonna be spending a whole lot of time flying around, shooting dudes, and if it's anything like No Man's Sky, a game I loved until my entire space trading operation was rendered obsolete, I was gonna love it. But this is about Starfield. Although, that comparison was very popular and led people to believe that that's what this was going to be. No Man's Skyrim, or Fallout Man's Sky. No, that one doesn't really work the same. But that's what myself and everyone who was hyped for this game kinda thought it was gonna be like. In my mind, this was gonna be the game that Bethesda made with Wild Wasteland automatically turned on. There were gonna be space weirdos, crazy planets, and enough interactions to keep me playing for years. My expectation was that this would be my forever game, like how some people treat Skyrim. And on paper, it has everything I'd want. It's a space game, there's ship customization, some little pieces of cyberpunk aesthetic, and space baddies. From the base game to whatever the future DLC and mod support will look like, there shouldn't have been a reason for me to stop playing this game for months. But here I am, a little over a month since release, 100% explored with almost 150 hours in, and I don't really feel compelled to keep playing anymore. Now, don't get me wrong, I've put a lot of hours into this game, and I've put a lot of hours in other single-player games too, and we don't really need to talk about 2K some years, but dropping a game like this early in its life just isn't normal for me. And I wasn't even planning on making a video for this, so I wasn't rushing or hate playing it like freaks on the internet do. I do like this game, and I will check out the DLC, and when official mod support is in the game, I'm definitely gonna come back, but I thought this was gonna be an easy 10 out of 10, and it's not. And since I'm going to be talking about certain quests and the overall story of the game, I do think it's important to have a proper spoiler warning, so that's what this is. Do what you gotta do. So there's 5 major storylines, and for me, only one of them was actually interesting. There's the Freestar Rangers quest, technically 2 UC missions, but we'll get to that later, working for Ryujin Industries, and the main Constellation quest. The Freestar Rangers just straight up was boring to me. In each of the other missions, there was something that at least felt like it pertained to both you and the wider universe. You did something or had the choice to do something that would have far-reaching consequences. None of that happens here. You reach the end, make your decision, and then look around saying, oh, that's it? Ron Hope being a part of some shadow government doesn't even matter because it doesn't get brought up again even when you meet other members of the council, and if you kill him, as you should, his company just gets taken over by the second in command. It's not like the company folds or you get locked out of anything. It's like you weren't even there. And because I ended up doing it near the end of my playthrough, the rewards you get didn't even matter. For me, it's easily the worst quest in the game and would be in the most bottom tier with everything else at least being 3 or 4 rungs above it. It's that bad. You don't even feel like a space cowboy. What is the point here? The next on my list would be Ryujin, which is just cyberpunk light with corpo espionage and neon, and while it does offer one of the better rewards, again, there's no real impact on anything in Neon or anywhere else. I did have fun playing it though, and if the stealth wasn't god-awful, which I'll get into later, it would probably be much higher. I do like the freedom that they give you to do some of the quests, but I want it to be stealthy, and that just made it a whole big struggle. I think the ending of this particular quest leaves more questions, both philosophical and just in general, like how is this going to work since the device that you get at the end takes away autonomy, but since you're never going to actually experience it yourself really loses any impact because you can just walk away like,
wouldn't let that shit happen to me though.
Next on this quest list would be the UC mission that involves the Terramorphs, because it actually feels like something that's important to the galaxy. And while the consequences don't immediately come up, and even before doing this mission, I never actually came across a Terramorph anyway, so it's not like that changed much, but at least from a story perspective, I think enough cool stuff happens that it makes you feel like you actually accomplished something, instead of just doing an extended side quest, which technically is what you're doing, but you know what I mean. And now, the last of the side faction quests is the UC Crimson Fleet quest. Now, I did say that one of the main reasons some of these faction missions were kind of lame was because there wasn't anything that dramatically, or even a little bit, that changes the worlds around you. And honestly, this one doesn't either. But I think it does have the best reward, the best story overall, and you finally get to be a pirate and do pirate stuff. Sure, the whole game should just let you do that and not de-incentivize even looking at a space cop wrong, but at least you can be a criminal for a little bit. I think if the other quests actually had real decisions like this one does, not only would the game as a whole be perceived differently, but I would be more inclined to actually do the other quests again during New Game Plus to see how things turn out. Kind of like Fallout 3, but you know, whatever. At least in this quest, you get to see a different side of the galaxy that you don't see in the other ones. And I wanted to end with the main quest, not because I think it's the best, but because I think it's indicative of a lot of the problems with the mission structure of this game. It's just really basic. Aside from meeting my baby girl Andresia and the mission where you go talk to the collector, there's really not much to say here. I think the whole artifact situation is just played out. There's no indication on where the artifacts actually come from, and while I think the New Game Plus justification in the story is actually really cool, it doesn't extend the story, and since there's a big chance you don't even get a new world that's different from your original one, like me, it makes the experience feel hollow. For what is the main faction of the game, I think the game tries to make every character interesting, but aside from the main four, you barely interact with the other ones. Walter has the most to do, and I think his little section in Neon is actually pretty good, but Mateo, Vladimir, and Noel are just kinda there. It just feels weird and like a missed opportunity when Constellation should be the most fleshed out group. Vasco's cool though. There's only one mission in the entire questline of the main story that I think is really interesting. Everything else is just kinda which I think is a really big mistake when in games like Fallout 3, 4, and Skyrim, there's definitely moments in the main quests of those games that I can remember today. I don't know if I'm gonna feel that way in 2, 3, 4, 5 years time. Overall, from the story front, I think the main quests are pretty underwhelming and actually took a backseat to general exploration and side quests where things actually felt fun and like you were a part of the world. Now, with the quests and everything being more meh than anything else, the gameplay is what actually did hold my interest through most of my playthrough. Now, the gameplay loop is basically the same as Skyrim if you switch out shouts for powers, but unlike that game, I almost never used them here because none of them were useful for how I play. Why use a particle beam when this gun just shreds anything in 2 seconds anyway? The only one that I used more than twice was precognition because I thought it would help for negotiations. It does not. But the best new inclusion for at least the moment-to-moment gameplay is definitely the jetpack. It's pretty straightforward. It's a jetpack. It doesn't do more than what you think it does, but it does add a new level of verticality to the encounters and makes traversal so much more fun because it speeds up those encounters. But going to a random place, exploring a little bit, shooting some dudes, and repeating is fun enough for me, with the shooting actually having some oomph to it and being much improved from Fallout 4. Considering that was probably my biggest fear of this game going into it, I'm very happy that they've changed it. But I do want to talk a little bit more about exploration in general, because I noticed that some people were saying that the game doesn't give you a reason to explore, which, what? I do think that the breaking up of space and planets does give off a smaller sandbox feel, and it does create a disconnect between them, but saying that the game actively de-incentivizes exploration is just flat out wrong. And I think people are misunderstanding actual exploration and just getting distracted by playing the game. From Bethesda's own catalog, in both Fallout and Skyrim, and I assume the other Elder Scrolls games, a lot of what you might consider to be exploration was setting a marker somewhere, walking towards it, then seeing something in a different direction in the distance, and going towards that instead on the way. Now, what this does is create a more cohesive experience, and it absolutely goes a long way to helping you lose yourself in the world. However, the actual issue is with the procedural generation in this game, not the splitting up of the system. For example, with Fallout, you learn to explore the world piece by piece. With Starfield, you're given the universe and told to explore on your own time. You can still explore and find interesting things that happen if you make the effort to. That's how you find the fun side quests. The only difference is that it's a conscious effort to explore now, rather than being like, well, I've been walking in this direction for a while, let me go see what that thing over there is first. Now, I do have my problems with this system because I do think that it causes the game to feel way more segmented than it needs to be, but acting like the game doesn't encourage you to explore is just so stupid. The thing that actually makes exploring boring very quickly is that the key locations are repeated a lot. And it gets to the point where if you are just exploring for exploration's sake, you'll come across a familiar building and be like, oh, I've already seen what's in there, I'm gonna go somewhere else. Even in the broken down buildings in Fallout or the mini caves in Skyrim, it never felt like you were seeing reruns. Each experience felt like a new one, so even if this one broken down school or whatever was kind of boring and didn't have anything in it, you still felt like the next one was gonna have something really cool in it. That doesn't happen here. And for me, that's where the replayability drops off a cliff, and where once you get into the end game, it's more of a, I guess I'll go in here and get some materials. And the New Game Plus features kinda make that worse. Spoilers, kinda not spoilers if you've ever played a video game before. When you start New Game Plus, all the things that you've collected are now gone, and the only materials you have in this game are a new suit and a cool looking but awful ship. So when you do a New Game Plus to actually be able to continue the cycle as the game allows and seems to encourage multiple Game Pluses, you will be in the same buildings, doing the same combat encounters, and skipping the same locked chests because, oh yeah, digipicking is kinda awful in this game. Now, I loved the mechanic in previous games, and I don't mind them innovating even if I'm not gonna be the biggest fan of it. Honestly, if they just brought back the Force Open option, having an unbreakable digipick, which they might, I don't know, I just didn't find it, or at the very least, don't use up one just by starting to lockpick, because that just seems dumb. Also, at the time of me writing this script, which lockpicking is bugged, because even if you have the skill that highlights what picks can be used, sometimes, like here, where I had to reload a master lock, the actual holes disappear. So to you, it looks like this one can fit, but it really can't. The actual loot system also doesn't really make digipicking all that useful when your return is a basic spec Orion laser gun in like an advanced lock or something. Unlocking doors is usually more worthwhile since there'll be materials for crafting, but even then you can just walk past a lot of locks and won't actually be missing out on anything. Another thing that I enjoyed in other games that this game just didn't seem to care much about is using stealth. It sucks in this game. You can't move without someone hearing you, even with the stealth skill maxed out, and while the concealment skill does help, needing 2 skills when 1 should be enough is bad. Even if you're far away from people and taking pot shots and the game says that you are hidden, they will still fire on your direct location. And if I were using a loud gun with a flash, I'd still be mad, but at least that could make sense. How are you going to tell me that while using my silent sniper from several dozen meters away to pick off a dude, a random merc was able to pinpoint my location and send shots my way in like 2 seconds? If they were this advanced, they shouldn't be running at me with a battle axe like this was Borderlands. And realistically, this wouldn't even be that big of a problem if it wasn't encouraged to use stealth throughout the game, especially during the Ryujin questline. But I do want to end this gameplay section on a positive note because the game does do something mostly right to me, and that's the ship customization / combat. Okay, just a little bit more negativity. I do think that having to go to different hubs and space stations to get certain parts is a little annoying, especially since you have to remember where everything is. Bethesda, if you're listening, one thing that you should add is a list of named outposts so that you could just select from that list and grab jump there, and even if it's outside of your grab jump range, you can just go along the path until you're close enough. That's just some free game from me. But back to the ships. I love being able to build your own ship and tailor it to what you want to do. I still don't understand when you'd actually be able to use the brig, since there was never a time that I could take a prisoner, but hey, sometimes things are just cool for cool's sake. On the combat side, I think the dogfights are fun and exciting, and because you can actually customize your ship with different weapons, I think it makes it far more dynamic, and you can dock with other ships and rob them. This is where a lot of my fun was had. Even though you can't take every ship in the game, even if you see it, and have the skills to fly every class of ship, which is annoying. But I thought that controlling the power to different systems on the ship was fun, and added something to do so that you're not just holding down the triggers the whole time. And even though it's very expensive to make a really powerful ship, which locks it to later in the playthrough, I think it's a good way to measure your growth as you go through the game. Overall, the main gameplay mechanics, shooting, I think I might have used the melee weapon once, I don't know if it's good, ships, and exploration are all still very fun, but the little things can get really grating over time. Okay, now I want to talk about the decision to have procedural generation in the game, because my opinion has changed since it was first announced. Initially, I was fine with it because I thought having that many planets handcrafted obviously meant the game was never coming out. I now think that it was actually a mistake, or at least how it was implemented. When you play the game, for the first several hours, you are really only interacting with 5 or so star systems consistently. So when you look at the map, you're thinking, wow, when I get over there, I'm sure there's gonna be a bunch of stuff to do. And then, as you make your way across the stars, you realize that the amount of special places are dwindling as you get further away. And that makes sense. That's literally how humans have migrated across history. But from a gameplay perspective, you feel less and less interested to keep going because each new star system you go to, it's barren, and you get trapped in the diamond mine meme. But instead of diamonds, it's Genghis Khan, and you're like, wow, that's super weird, but I'm glad I saw it. The parts of the game that do have that Bethesda touch are great, and if we got 4 or 5 more of those locations and cut down on what I would call the farming planets, I think this would be a much more enjoyable experience, because then it would feel more like a crafted experience rather than a sandbox, which is where I think the game stumbles. Using procedural generation to make each person's playthrough wholly unique would go a long way to make this game better, but since they didn't do that, we're left with 95% filler that really feels like things that just could have been on the cutting room floor. I think the thing that sets Starfield apart from the other Bethesda games is that Elder Scrolls and Fallout have interesting and more apparent fleshed out worlds. There's real history that permeates through every step of the game, and I think that's what Starfield is missing. I'm not saying that there's not lore. Sure, there's history. You can find what happened to Earth, the Colony War, and little things about settlements, but they don't really feel tied to anything. The atmosphere is off. This could be another criticism of the way that the game is structured, but even if you dropped all the major cities in one map, honestly, I think it would feel even worse because they're all so varied aesthetically, and trying to explain why there's a cowboy town, Night City Light, and Breach from Halo all within even 1,000 miles of each other would kind of be a stretch. But the vibe of the cities isn't the only weird part of it to me. The more that I think about it, the game just feels too clean. Aside from the game dumping gallons of blood on the floor sometimes, it just doesn't actually feel lived in. It doesn't feel as gritty as it should. Each area feels more like window dressing, like they should be in the background rather than front and center. I still had fun exploring, meeting new people, shooting those people, and then taking their stuff when the game would let me. But unlike previous games before, even though Fallout 4 kind of had a similar vibe, it just still feels off. The game also has such a weird goody two-shoes vibe that I don't really understand. I think it would be an interesting argument to have that the game is like this because in some sort of authoritarian way, the game is forcing you down a path like the UC have done in general, but that's like headcanon-y and really only justifies the game the way it is and not why opening it up and having different perspectives could be better. I wish they had brought back the morality system and made it actually impact you like the traits should have done. I picked being a scoundrel because, of course I did, and the only times it would come up was in sparse dialogue choices and some UC guys talking about my file, which just adds more questions like 1, why do they have my file? 2, why don't I have access to better fences to sell my stuff? Why don't my parents scold me for being a scoundrel? Why does it seem like nothing actually matters here.
I don't have the answer to these questions.
I think I was more harsh because I had such high expectations for this game. Aside from Yakuza Gaiden coming out, I thought this was going to be the best thing that I played not only this year, but probably the last 5. And it just was not. But even with lower expectations, some of the execution in those decisions just don't make this as fun and engaging as I would have liked. With all the achievements unlocked, New Game Plus 3 and 4 for whatever is going to come next, I am excited to see how they expand the game in the future, but after reflecting on the game, what I enjoyed and everything that I didn't, this was much more of a disappointment than I thought. For all the things that people on the internet tended to grab onto, the facial animations, load screens, glitches, none of that stuff impacted my fun with the game, so aside from the one instance where I needed to reload a save, and then a situation where, no matter what I did, a ship I was supposed to go to in a side quest did not load, all my bugs and glitches were more funny than anything else. I also made sure to at least play a little bit on my Series X to see if there was a significant difference, and while it's definitely much smoother on my PC, considering my PC is high spec for work and editing, the difference was actually much smaller than I would have assumed. Bethesda wanted to make something different from Fallout and Elder Scrolls, and while it does fall short of what I think its potential could have been at launch, they did succeed. Starfield does feel different. It feels like people really just wanted to play the same game they had played before with a space coat of paint, and for better or for worse, they didn't do that. They did make something new, something that I did enjoy playing, even if that experience didn't meet my expectation. But what did you think? If you played the game, drop what you thought about it in the comments. If you're still on the fence, I would still say to play it because there's still a lot to like here, and even though there's little things that I had problems with that I hadn't even mentioned, like base building being mostly worthless, and the alien life being generic and repeating across systems, but if you don't assume that it'll be a 10 out of 10 like I did, I'm sure you'll have a better time. So yeah, like, comment, subscribe, do all the things that tell YouTube that I am, in fact, uploading again, and thanks for watching.